Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Last week I participated in the Wowie Jam hosted by Jonas Tyroller. The Wowie Jam typically has a very unique and interesting theme, so I was excited to participate. This year the theme was
collaborate with AI.
This was probably the most difficult theme I had seen in a jam, so I was excited to take on the challenge. The most obvious interpretation of the theme, of course, is to simply create a game and then slap on an AI collaborator. But that was boring, and coding an AI that would actually be helpful is not an easy task. So instead, I started thinking about some of the applications of AI that we see in real life. There are so many different things that AI can do far better than humans ever could. But there's one thing that AI cannot do. One thing keeping the machine overlords from taking over. The final barrier that no AI shall ever pass. So I decided the most productive way to spend my weekend was to try and make CAPTCHAs fun. I started by creating some basic art for objects that the player would have to recognize. I thought it would be funny if the player had to solve all these CAPTCHAs because their self-driving car can't recognize objects in the road. Following that theme, I made sprites for a car, a pickup truck, a stop sign, a traffic light, and a fire hydrant. I drew these sprites by taking an image off the internet, tracing the outlines of the details I wanted to include, and then filling them with a solid color. That way, all of the important shapes line up and your brain will recognize the object, even though it's completely different from the original picture. Once the art was done, I spent the rest of the day figuring out how I wanted everything to look in-game. After a lot of trial and error and some epic feedback from the Wowie Discord server, I settled on this. The camera would be given a random height and rotation, then each sprite would be given a random position within view of the camera, and their own drop shadow as well. Finally, the road would be randomly rotated and displaced. In the background, I had an inverted sphere to create a sky and a horizon line, as well as some fog to blur the line a bit. The next day, I worked on fixing some issues where objects could be hidden behind other objects, making the game unfair. My solution was to place the objects from left to right with a random offset between each one. I then made the offset have a minimum value so that they wouldn't generate too close, and added some extra maths to make sure that they were evenly spread out. With this done, I duplicated the setup 8 times and made each camera render to a different square on the screen. Next, I made it so that the game would pick one of the objects the player must identify and generate that object in exactly one of the cameras. I also made the game refresh the cameras once every couple seconds, though this time decreases as you play. Also, every 8th refresh, the game chooses and displays a new object for the player to identify. With that done, all that was left was to add a score display at the end, and the game loop was done. I sent the prototype off to the Discord for some playtesting and got some really good feedback. One of the things that was pointed out was that there wasn't much time to recover if you made a mistake. So I fixed that by giving a warning screen every time the player missed an object, and then I picked a new one for them to identify as well. I found it to be very helpful to have little moments of rest or slight pauses during intense gameplay so that the player doesn't get overwhelmed or panicky. It also adds a nice sense of progression and helps the player to focus harder, actually making the game even more intense. With the gameplay mostly finished, I moved on to polish. Lots and lots of polish. The first thing I focused on was the audio. I am no musician, so I had to rely entirely on sound effects to fill the silence. First off, I downloaded a royalty-free drum sound effect and bit crushed it. Next, I recorded myself saying each object and then bit crushed those recordings. I also needed a sound effect for crashing into an object, so I downloaded a tire screech and a glass shattering sound and slapped them together and bit crushed them. The next sound effect I needed was the engine sound for the car. After unsuccessfully scouring the internet for good free engine sounds, I decided to record my own. After making race car noises into my microphone for 5 minutes like a motorsports obsessed 4-year-old, I had something to work with. I cleaned the recording up a bit crushed it, and then set it to play on loop in the background. Now that the audio was sounding passable, it was time to work on the graphics. I needed something for the background, so I downloaded a free image of a circuit board from online. This was already a huge improvement, but it still didn't really feel like you're in a car. To fix this, I added some subtle screen shake. This really helped to make it feel like you're actually in a moving vehicle. Next, I added some display text, a start screen, and most importantly, a vignette. After that was done, I realized the game needed a few more sound effects, so I bit crushed an engine idling, an ignition sound when the game starts, and an explosion when you crash. At this point, the game was essentially done, but it did need some explanation for the player to understand what and why they were doing. So I made a quick dialogue system, then wrote some narrative to appear at the beginning of the game and sometimes after you crash. Looking back, I might have gone a little bit overboard writing a huge block of text, but at least it's kind of interesting. With all that done, all it was left to do was to hope I could get the game uploaded to itch before the deadline. No!